there were a lot of heroes in this, but there were two doctors, Mackenzie and Ramsay, who did so much for the people under their charge. I mean, Ramsay spent longer in solitary confinement than anybody else, and that would be for arguing for medicines, and he'd be beaten up and he'd be thrown in solitary, and then he'd do it again. Mackenzie, there was a point where he couldn't walk anymore, and when he collapsed, two men came forward and carried him along. And then when their strength gave out, two more came along, and they just kept going until in the end he called over the Japanese on a break and said, "I want you to shoot me."
For Honour's Sake is the new podcast from AJEX, the Jewish Military Association, and I'm delighted to introduce our first guest, Dan Berke. Dan is a Manchester-based solicitor specialising in criminal and regulatory law, and in 2021 he published Captured Behind Japanese Lines, a history of his grandfather, Frank Berkovitch's experiences fighting as one of Ord Wingate's Chindits in Burma during World War II. It's a story he describes as one he was compelled to tell. Dan, thanks for talking to us.
Thank you for having me on.
Okay. I wonder if we could start, as we should, at the beginning. For those of us of our generation, I think we were kind of almost born aware of what our grandparents and great-grandparents did and their service in the world wars, and particularly for us, World War II. But were there particular moments that first raised your awareness of what Frank had done and gone through?
We had an awareness, but certainly I didn't have that much more than that, because my grandfather, Frank, he didn't speak about it. There was the odd snippet of something that he said. I had heard that he'd been in the Chindits. I knew he'd been a prisoner of war of the Japanese. I remember him telling me he was a Bren gunner. And I remember once when my brother and I were shooting each other with toy guns, he got quite upset and said it's a very sad thing to have to kill someone. But he didn't talk. And if you wanted to talk about it, you get a very laconic answer, and it would be fairly clear that he didn't want to take the conversation further. And we learned to just live with that. So, our conversations rarely went on to anything to do with the military. And it wasn't until after he died that I started to learn about it. But looking back, the 21 years that he was in my life, I never once saw him smile. I never once heard him laugh. Now we know he had what would be called PTSD. Back then we didn't. And it affected him very badly. And I don't think he knew how any happy memories he had before the war were gone. And afterwards, I think he lived with ghosts, and these were very hard things to talk about. I remember I was doing a book launch for Captured Behind Japanese Lines, and one of my uncles told me that when he was a small boy, he'd gone to, my grandfather had come to visit his house, and they were sitting in the kitchen, and there was a tap dripping, and his head went into his hands, and he became really quite hysterical, screaming to turn the tap off. So we knew there was something wrong, just not what. And then some years after he died, I think it was about 2014, I was going to Vietnam, and I was just looking for a book to read on the plane. I was at my mother's house. There was a book there called Return via Rangoon by Philip Stibbe, who was a lieutenant in the Chindits. And I thought, well, that'll do. And I grabbed it off the shelf. My grandfather was mentioned in it in the POW camp as just being the camp tailor in Rangoon. But it was the first I ever really read about the Chindits, and it was incredible. Clearly one of the early special forces units, long-range penetration behind Japanese lines in Burma. Extremely tough men doing an extremely tough job. 3,000 went in and 1,000 never returned. And when I got back, I mentioned it to my parents. My mum said, I think we've got a memo that he wrote. I think he wrote it for a student. And it was just in some paper she wrote. It was 13 handwritten pages. And it's funny they could write this for a student that was researching but couldn't talk about it to his family. I appreciate writing things down and talking about them are very different, but it was fascinating, and I suppose it became a bit of an addiction for a while, where I, through National Archives, through Forces Network, online research, etc., I started to learn more and more about the Chindits, about this immaculate lunatic, Wingate, and the people that he attracted, and this incredible operation and these remarkable men. And actually, although it had been my intention to learn about my grandfather, I had the privilege of learning about many other incredible people.
Thank you. So, I mean, the excerpts, going back to those 13 pages, the excerpts that are in your book, some of them are really incredibly detailed. Do you think that Frank had perhaps kept a diary, or were these just purely from memory?
No, they were memories.
Amazing.
The more detailed, the more detailed parts are before he was captured. After he was captured, there was some detail. Before he went into Burma. When he was in Burma, some of it's actually quite, again, it's quite sparse in his language. He talks about, we marched on Nanking, we blew bridges behind us, then we marched to Tatooine. We fought many, numerous actions. Every single one of those probably could have been a book in itself. But it wasn't.
Yeah, I mean, I know there's one point where actually he gets to the point where it's probably the most difficult and the most considered part of of Longcloth, the initial crossing of the Irrawaddy, and his notes just read, "Then we crossed the Irrawaddy," and that's it. He just sort of laconic way to describe what was an incredible operation. All the more so because the attempts to cross it on the way back were again described in much more detail, and of course were unsuccessful, and really gave a sense of just how dangerous and difficult that was.
I mean, the return crossing, and as you say, starts at the beginning. Actually, let's go back to the Chindwin. They're trained in India, and anybody who couldn't make the grade would drop out. They weren't pushed to pass this selection test. It was, if you can do it under your own steam, do it. If you can't, you don't belong. And they crossed from India on foot into Burma, but then crossing the Chindwin was the first big obstacle, and actually they managed to cross that unopposed. But it was difficult because it was a bit like a circus. They had elephants, buffaloes, lots and lots of mules. They had column dogs. Each column had a dog with it that was trained to run messages. One actually called Judy, Staffordshire Bull Terrier, survived the expedition. They managed to cross unopposed. They also sent a decoy force to the south whose job was to be spotted. They were 1 and 2 columns, and they got involved in some pretty punchy encounters. But then, having operated fairly successfully on the west of the Irrawaddy, causing havoc, there weren't enough of them to hold any land. Their job, brigade column, Wingate's column, their job was to encourage rebellion amongst the tribes and to spread propaganda and gain information. My grandfather was in that column. He was Wingate's Batman. And the others under some really impressive officers, Mike Calvert, who went on to join the SAS, and then was commander of the Malayan Scouts, and Bernard Ferguson, and the really special characters who Ferguson's friends had warned him, stay away from Wingate, he's crazy, this isn't going to do your career any good. He didn't seem to care. They'd operated very well around there. They were blowing up bridges, they were ambushing Japanese patrols, and it caused the Japanese army to send a lot of troops away from their other operations. But then they crossed the Irrawaddy, and probably that was a mistake. because they didn't know enough about it. On the east of the Irrawaddy, there's very little water. The men were exhausted at this point. Not exhaustion as the average person knows it, but their bodies were wasting away. They'd been in the jungle for almost 3 months at that point. And they didn't know enough about the size of the Japanese strength. The monsoons were coming in, which would make the Irrawaddy impassable, and the Shweli. So they did cross. They weren't particularly effective on the east side. They did gather intelligence about what future forces coming over could expect, but they really paid for it, because they were being closed in really between an increasingly impassable river as the rains were coming and the river was getting faster, and a very angry Japanese force closing in on them. And crossing back again was awful. There's some thoughts when they all tried to, they all gathered together as a force. Some boats went across, they came under fire, and Wingate, seeing those boats destroyed, ordered groups to disperse into small groups and try and make your own way back to India or China or Fort Hurst in the north. But there's a number of survivors of the expedition felt that actually they should have tried to cross while they were still a large force. They were still a force to be reckoned with, and to try and bully their way across, rather than splitting into smaller groups, which became extremely difficult. And I mentioned Bernard Ferguson. I mean, they were crossing some confluence of the Shweli River at night with the Japanese hot on their heels, and the river was really fast. I mean, when you see the river, it actually looks like a mirror, but underneath it's got a hell of a current. And when they tried crossing at night time, some of the men were swept away from a sandbank, and the other men could hear their screams. And a number of them just lost their nerve and couldn't cross, and were left on this sandbank. And he had this dreadful decision to make, which was, do I stay and help the 40 or so people on that sandbank, risking the rest of the force, those, in his words, that had put their faith in Providence and crossed, or do we go? And he had to make the decision to go. And he did say that he knew it was the right decision, but it was one that haunted him every day of his life.
Sure. And I mean, in many ways, the stories that you tell of Frank are ones of the difficulties and the decisions and the resilience that so many had to conjure up from that entire generation, and reflected in, again, so many of the small anecdotes that you came across in your research. I'm thinking particularly of the clip you found of Leon Frank, another Jewish tailor, who in his interview for the Imperial War Museum, I believe, spoke about how there was another fella called Berkovitch, and he was a Jewish fella, and he was very, very religious. He used to pray every night. He was really sincere. Like many of the lads with their own faiths, he used to sleep on his hat at night because we didn't have any pillows or anything like that. It's after their initial capture. So he used to sleep on his hat on top of a block of wood. So when he put his hat on his head in the morning, he looked like Napoleon. He was the funniest thing out. It's amazing to think of how they found humour in those circumstances, even the very worst of circumstances.
I mean, there was a lot of humour through the expedition. I mean, it's worth really looking at the kind of people that formed the Chindits. Wingate did not want ordinary people. He wanted extraordinary people. And he had a history of finding them. He had run patrols in Abyssinia, Sudan, pre-state Israel. And he was always after exceptional people. A number of the ones that he trained in Israel in the special night squadrons included people who really went on to be very, very senior in the IDF. Moshe Dayan, Yigal Alon, Yigal Yadin. And he set up these small groups of about 30 men, 15 British, 15 Jewish, to go and take the fight to the Arab gangs that had been terrorizing the kibbutzim. Nobody had tried this before. It was sort of intelligence-based raids. And they were incredibly successful. Again, he was going for people who were really out of the ordinary. And he seemed to be fueled by some sense that what he was doing was divine. I mean, he'd actually chosen as his base the same place where Gideon gathered his 300 to fight the Midianites. And he had 10 squads of 30 men each, so same number, 300. And so he'd really gone for unusual people. And I think they were so unorthodox. And Leon Frank is a prime example of that. This is an East End tailor, great sense of humour. He was a military policeman before he joined the Chindits, and he had all sorts of stories about having to tackle, because he was only about 5'3" or something, and trying to tackle sort of very big drunk men. And I think that there was an incredible mix. I mean, my grandfather was a tailor from Manchester. His father, he had a hard life. His father had been confined to a mental hospital for the rest of his life after World War One. We can only imagine why. He had a brother who was killed in a gang fight, or he got on the wrong side of some gangsters. And their parents were immigrants, and it was tough. And one thing my grandfather wasn't, he wasn't blessed with a sense of humour. I don't know if he had one any. I mean, Leon Frank says he was quite serious. I think that sounds about right. But there were some real characters there, and the stories that came out of them are great. And one of the most remarkable accounts I read is called "Safer Than a Known Way," about Chindit. You see, one of the things, if they were injured, the choices in the jungle were absolutely diabolical. It was either officers were trained to give lethal doses of morphine, or leave them with a village and hope they're treated well, or possibly hand them over to the Japanese in the hope that they will be treated well. And these are decisions. And Mike Calvert, some of his men were injured, and he chose to leave a note with the men to any passing Japanese patrol, saying these men have been wounded in action. They're soldiers. They've been doing their duty in accordance with your code of Bushido. We hope you'll look after them. And fortunately, they did. But there were many that were not. Some were murdered by local Burmese bandits. Some were sold to the Japanese. Some were very well looked after by the Burmese, or certainly some of the Burmese tribes, the Kachin and the Karen in particular. But for the most part, if the Japanese got them, unfortunately, some were used as bayonet practice. But it's incredible account, Safer Than a Known Way. It's a Chindit who is left behind, and the book starts with him putting a gun in his mouth and trying to count to 3 and pull the trigger, and he can't do it. And thinks, well, if I've got 300 miles to get out of here, if I can do 1 mile a day. And the resilience of them is really incredible, and you see that more than anywhere in the camps. Where they're really tested. I mean, on the same recording of Leon Frank, and anyone listening to this, I urge them to log on to the IWM and listen to some of these accounts. But Leon talks about some airmen who had been badly wounded. So badly wounded that they begged the Japanese guards for a revolver to be able to end it for them. And when he's talking about that, he's sobbing. And it's very hard, but it's something that we can't relate to in this world, to ask for a gun to shoot one of your own comrades because they're just in agony and there's no hope of survival. They really were incredible men. I think in the camps you see it more than anywhere else, what they would do for each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And it must have been incredible as you went through all these archives, and particularly the IWM interviews, to suddenly come across references to Private Berkovitch and Frank Berkovitch. How did it feel finding these little jewels of information that were about your grandfather?
It was jewels. It was like finding treasure, because he didn't talk about it, and it was important as well, because sometimes I'd go down the wrong route. And initially, I think my brother Richard had paid a researcher from a forces organisation, to try and give us any information. And based on Frank's capture card, they thought that he had been with 8 Column and had been captured after a battle in a place called Bor. But it was incorrect. It was just a, perhaps lazy Japanese clerk in the camp who would just put the same date on everybody's cards. And actually, he was captured sometime after that. And we could see that from the accounts that we were reading, it just didn't add up. And then we were able, through other things we found, to determine that he'd been Wingate's Batman and that he was certainly in Brigade Column.
He was obviously very close to Wingate. The telegram that your great grandmother Sarah received really showed that after the capture, she'd written to Ord Wingate to ask for further information beyond the simple ministry telegram that she got. And Wingate writes back to say, "You say your son was your main support. In that case, until you receive news of him, I hope you will allow me to fill his place in this respect. Please let me know what you need and regard it as a gift gladly made in honour of my friend Berkovitch." Not Private Berkovitch, not Frank Berkovitch, but his friend. In the course of your research, again, Wingate is such a significant character in British military history. Has your research really added to our understanding of Wingate as well? Did much new come out about him, particularly with Frank as his Batman?
So there's a lot of literature on Wingate. One by Dennis Tulloch was a friend of his from school days. And so there's a lot of information about him and about his character. And he really was a character, a divisive one, probably a genius. Certainly Churchill thought that. Possibly a man of destiny. Certainly Churchill thought that. I don't know if it's added much. There was some who felt that he could be a bit cavalier, actually, with the lives of his men. There are others that understood this is war and, sadly people will die. Some felt abandoned by him, others felt supported every step of the way. When they were planning Operation Thursday, the second expedition, my grandfather, of course, was in Longcloth, which was the first Chindit expedition. There were some soldiers in hospital, having survived Longcloth, who didn't want to see him again. There were others that said, well, what are you going to be doing after this? Well, wherever Wingate goes, I'm going. I do know my grandfather thought the world of him. That is one of the few things I remember him saying. But he was an incredible character. I think his guesswork. But my grandfather had studied in a yeshiva in Gateshead, in a very religious Jewish community, in a very religious Jewish school, and he was pious. He went to the synagogue every day of his life, as I remember. And I think it's very possible that Wingate, who had taught himself Hebrew, who knew the Old Testament like the back of his hand, he was a deeply religious member of the Plymouth Brethren. So I suspect there were periods when they were sitting around. They would talk about those stories and about ideas, for example, for a Jewish state, biblical Hebrew, that sort of thing. And so maybe something approaching a friendship developed, but that letter was absolutely remarkable.
Extraordinary, probably unique, I think, for a major general to be writing to the mother of a private in that way. So on the discovery of Frank's 13 pages, it's obviously inspired you to research further. And it wasn't just about the National Archives and research looking into what had already been done. You actually made the decision that you had to go out to India and Burma yourself, indeed with your father. I'm just wondering what your father's reaction was to you developing this plan and these adventures.
He's quite indulgent. I mean, he didn't come to Burma with me. I think there was a sense that he would find that a bit hard. because his dad had never spoken to him about it, and I was going to places where he'd really suffered. I wasn't. Frank was captured as he tried to cross the Irrawaddy coming back, and at the point that he was caught, about 7 of them in his group, they were starving, no doubt scared, desperate. I think there's a sense of hopelessness in his note where he says, we're wondering if we ever see home again. They were so thirsty they tracked elephants and actually drank elephant urine to stay alive, which I thought was a great story when I was a kid. He'd suffered. His sergeants had been killed when they were ambushed. He'd been beaten up. They'd been put in bamboo cages, hands tied together, not knowing if they'd live. They'd been on a death march to Bamo prison, told if anyone drops behind, you'll be killed. If anyone runs away, you'll all be killed. Then he went to Pienilawin, in a hill town called Mamio, which was a sort of British colonial town. It's actually gorgeous.
It comes across in the book. Again, you talk about walking the same places and seeing the same things that Frank would have been at or that he would have seen as you move through India and into Burma as well. It comes across in the book that you felt particularly close to him at Pienilawin.
Yeah, it was hard because I think that's probably the camp they suffered at the most. There was a Japanese unit which conducted experiments on prisoners of war. And some of the prisoners of war suffered from those experiments. I met with Stephen Fogden, who's probably the leading Chindit researcher. And his grandfather, Arthur Howney, died days after arriving at Rangoon prisoner of war camp. I think my grandfather probably buried him. And I remember having a beer with Stephen. His grandfather had been in Pienilawin, and he said, I hope they didn't carry out experiments on him. And he was worried they did because he died shortly after arriving to Rangoon. Thinks they probably didn't, but couldn't be sure. It's a horrible thing to have to think about. They would inject people with pathogens and all sorts and submit them to horrific experiments. And that camp is where they would teach people to submit to Japanese authority. So numbering off, bowing, and if the bow wasn't low enough or long enough, you'd be beaten up. It was a horrific place. And I remember, I think it's one of the important things about going somewhere to see it. I'm a lawyer, I like evidence. And I knew it was an area near to the train station. I got to the train station, and of course there was nothing there. And why should there be? It's not for the people of Burma to create some sort of memorial. They didn't choose to be involved in this. But there was nothing there, but they were kept in sort of small huts. I did find an Anglican church there. I met, when I was there, I met one of the most wonderful people I could ever hope to meet. I was just wandering around the train tracks, looking around with a map, trying to work out where this would have been. And a lady asked me, she said, are you English? I said, yes. And she said she was called Serena Flock, and her grandfather had been an Irish guy that had worked there and he married or settled down with the local lady who was a grandmother. She was part of the Christian community, and she worked, I think, 5 days a week in a school, and 2 days a week she'd volunteer in an orphanage. And I found myself spending a couple of hours teaching English there. And she showed me around, and they've got this sort of botanical gardens. They've got, so it's quite an affluent place. A lot of Burmese senior military, who are obviously extremely powerful in Burma, have summer homes there. But I know this is a place they suffered very badly. I also was able to cross the Irrawaddy on a sampan boat. I mean, there's no roads that I had to go on a motorbike. and the motorbike was sort of held together with sellotape. And the first one I wouldn't get on because it had a Liverpool FC seat, and I was trying explaining that to a rental company. So I went to, there were times you'd have to climb off it, push it through a load of water. And we got onto this sampan boat with a couple of buffaloes, some motorbikes, some locals, and crossed this river where the Shweli and the Irrawaddy meet. And we got to a town called Iniwa. And it's where the Chindits are crossed over to. They crossed from this town called Hintha to Iniwa. But it was a town that was friendly to the Japanese, so the British quickly surrounded it to gather what intelligence they could before moving on. But it was incredible to walk where they had walked, and we actually found, and the locals were incredibly friendly, and they helped me find a man. He wasn't sure how old he was, but probably in his 80s, and he'd been a novice monk. And he remembered soldiers coming through there and being told to stay away because we don't know what we're dealing with. But he was curious because he was a boy, so he went to see. And he remembered them going through there, which I thought was really quite incredible.
I mean, you speak of. I mean, I think you're to me, you're coming across as very modest about just how adventurous this pursuit of evidence, perhaps common to both solicitors and historians, were. You were at some points deep in the jungle. There was also a point at which you had a confrontation with a military police officer for an area you were going into, and he was going to take your passport and everything else.
That was when, we wanted to go to. I wanted to go where it had been captured, a place called Wingate, and I see a lot of these places they're not very easy to find because Burma or Myanmar has been so shut off from the world for so long. When I'd gone, it was just very briefly a democracy.
This was 2017.
Yeah, shortly after I got back, the military took over again. And the town of Bor that I mentioned earlier just no longer exists. Just packed up and moving. Yeah, and the guide had made some inquiries and told no, the village was actually abandoned because people heard strange noises and screaming at night. I thought it sounds like my house, but they just decided to pack up and move off. They thought there were bad spirits there, and Twingo was quite a tricky one to find, and Google Earth was helpful. But this is where he was caught, on the banks of the Irrawaddy, and I was trying to get in there. But there's whole areas of Burma that are closed off because of mining for rubies or military activities. Of course, there were the awful situation going on with the Rohingya closer towards the Bangladesh area. So there's whole areas where the military just won't let you in. I got caught in the only traffic jam I saw when I was there. It was just, as far as you could see, trucks laden with teak headed for China. And in Wingate, there was a quite unpleasant official who stunk of booze, and he wanted my passport, and he was getting quite aggressive. And there was just no way I was handing it over to him because it's not somewhere to be without all the right paperwork. So, and he started shouting something into the phone. I said to the driver, I think we'd better go. Well, he said to me, we'd better go. We went. So, but it's an incredible place. I mean, I went to the War Graves Cemetery, which is one of those places. It's too big to sort of comprehend. I mean, there's 26,000 graves or names there. A lot don't have graves. There were so many graves known unto God, sure. And then you'd see Gurkhas, British, Canadian, Nigerians. There were Nigerians in the second Chindit expedition, nicknamed the Spider-Men, who achieved incredible things, all lying together. And then on these columns where they've not found the bodies, and I was trying to find two in particular. The sergeant was with my grandfather when they were captured. He was killed. Yeah, Ed Burrows. He was killed. I think it was from around the corner from me in Swinton. And Arthur Best, who was murdered on the death march out of Rangoon prisoner of war camp at the very end. And they were sort of high up on these columns, but it's just overwhelming. There are just so many lying there, and it's heartbreaking.
You talk about Burroughs in the book and an attempt to contact any surviving family. There's been no progress on that.
No.
Again, I don't know who might be listening, but this is the story as part of Frank's that Dan uncovered of Sergeant Ed Burroughs of the 13th Battalion, the King's Regiment, Liverpool. And he was the son of Tom and Edith Burroughs and husband of Eunice Burroughs of Swinton, Lancashire. If anybody does find that familiar in any way, do get in touch and let us know.
Thank you. It was, there were so many families that were just wiped out there. It was the end of a line, and I hope that wasn't one. But, he was someone that, he'd fought with my grandfather, he'd suffered with him, he'd been through this desperate attempt to escape. They'd, crawled up on this village at the end, trying to, not knowing whether it was a roll of the dice. It came out wrong.
Absolutely.
You were asking about India as well. I should mention India, by the way, because you did ask about that. India was, in terms of preparation, it probably wasn't that much use for the Chindits, because the jungles in India are completely different to the jungles in Burma. The jungles in Burma are a wet jungle. It sort of eats you alive. India was a bit different to that. But they certainly got fit. They, as part of the selection test, would have to cover 60 miles, I think, in 3 nights, carrying 80 pounds of kit and weapons. And it really was an attempt to separate the men from the boys. And Wingate was looking for people that were resilient and resourceful. And we were able to actually go and see these areas that they trained in. It was incredible. And I think for us, we can flip on the internet and see anything about any country we want to, but back then they would have known absolutely nothing about.
Like going to another planet almost.
Going to another planet. It was, we talk about India as being one of those places where it's an assault on your senses, and it really is. The colours and the spices and everything. It's an amazing place. But for these guys, it really must have been entirely alien. And I think they all seem to have really enjoyed the time there. And for those that had it in them to get through this selection test that Wingate had set down, they were really quite bonded. I think one of the most incredible things is when they were paraded just before they went into Burma in front of Field Marshal Wavell. Yeah. And in recognition of how unprecedented and how dangerous this mission was, he saluted them before they could salute him, which I'm not aware of that happening anywhere else.
No, again, I think it was an incredible precedent. Not even a precedent. I don't think
gesture of, yeah.
I think that was an incredible gesture, not one that I'm aware was ever repeated, but completely reflects what they've been through in training. And of course, many of them didn't make it. You made the point that your belief that Frank rather enjoyed India, or was certainly inspired by everything that went on by Wingate himself, was reflected in the fact that he did, as you say, stay the course. Each time a man gave up and dropped out, he resisted the temptation to follow. As he crawled into his makeshift shelter, known as a basher, at the end of a night march, he fought down the voice that told him to stay there and not continue. His body became conditioned as his capacity for exercise increased and his muscles developed. He became accustomed to the weights and the distances, skilled with weapons, and with these abilities, his self-control. Confidence grew as day by day, the tailor became a soldier. Now, without wanting to compare at all what Frank went through in his training and his fighting and after his capture, as I say, there were very adventurous elements to your research out there. In at least 2 or 3 places, the locals said that you were the first Westerner that they had seen since the British soldiers
had been incredible.
There, which is incredible. Did you get a sense yourself, and I'm interested in your process here, as you were there and as you were going through it, of the solicitor turning into the historian and adventurer?
Well, I don't think I was an adventurer, but it was... I think being a lawyer helps, because we're looking for evidence. We're looking for things that support our evidence. And sometimes we have a saying in law, locus in quo, going to the scene. It's often the only way to do it. I've dealt with many cases where you need to go to the scene of the alleged crime and look around. And in many respects, it was no different, just further away. But it was incredible to be told that no Westerner had been there. I think it was, like I say, it was just some of these areas were a little bit inaccessible, having to go there on motorbikes, etc. It's not a holiday destination, and because Burma's been so closed off, and the bits of India that tourists will tend to go to, Taj Mahal or Goa or wherever, these jungle areas were just quite off the beaten track. So yeah, it was quite fun to uncover those places.
Absolutely. And as you say, it's been almost impossible with some, especially Wingate, which plays such an important part in the story, to even pinpoint where that was at the time. Any progress on that or any other locations?
Well, Wingate found, that's the one where I got into that's where I got into an argument and they wouldn't let me in.
Right.
Bor was just inaccessible, and some of the other areas they just weren't sure where they were anymore.
Yeah.
And I think they're gone. The villagers move for whatever reason. They're not very agrarian communities in some parts, and they're not particularly interested in whether someone wants to come and dig up the past.
So reclaimed by the jungle as well, perhaps.
But I think the one that was the most special for me was when at this point Frank had done 2 years in Rangoon prisoner of war camp, I think. And it was brutal. They were used as slave labour. There'd been cholera outbreaks. People would die from beriberi. He became the camp undertaker. But at the very end, they were told to assemble all the people that could still walk. And they knew the end was near because they could hear the B-52 bombers getting near. And this is after around the time that the force of the Indian Army and Gurkhas had carried out Operation Dracula to retake the docks at Rangoon. So I think everybody knew the end was near. The Japanese started burning records, and they ordered any men that were still fit, with a very small f, to assemble in the courtyard, and Frank was among them, and they were ordered to march out. And they were destined probably for Thailand, or at least to go over the Sitang River, where there was really a diehard Japanese force dug in, ready to fight it out to the last man, and they meant it. So whether they were to be used as human shields or further slave labour isn't clear. But they were marched out. The sick remained in the camp. I think each group was very fearful the other were going to be killed. Fortunately, those that remained in the camp were rescued. The Japanese abandoned them. And the march out along this Pegu road, past the sort of prone airfield, was a death march. If anyone fell behind, they would be murdered. Someone I mentioned earlier, Arthur Best, was murdered. And they had nothing left. There was nothing left in the tank. And they had Colonel with them, Colonel Mackenzie, who again wrote an incredible book about his time as a doctor in Rangoon jail. And the doctors, there were a lot of heroes in this, but there were 2 doctors, Mackenzie and Ramsay, who did so much for the people under their charge. I mean, Ramsay spent longer in solitary confinement than anybody else, and that would be for arguing for medicines, and he'd be beaten up and he'd be thrown in solitary, and then he'd do it again. Mackenzie, there was a point where he couldn't walk anymore, and when he collapsed, 2 men came forward and carried him along. And then when their strength gave out, 2 more came along, and they just kept going until in the end he called over the Japanese on a break and said, "I want you to shoot me." I can't. He wasn't prepared to do this to the men anymore. He even drew a mark on his shirt where his heart is and told them to shoot him there. And they went off and had a bit of a chat with the huddle with their comrades. And And then there was this incredible moment where Colonel Power and Brigadier Hobson stood in front of the men and told them that the Japanese had abandoned them and they were free men. And then there was an awful incident where they were strafed by their own planes, and this Brigadier Hobson, who had done so much for them, he was the ranking officer. And again, because of his rank, the Japanese commandant used to beat him up in front of the men with a steel golf club, solitary confinement, frequent humiliation and beatings, and he just kept them going. And he was killed in that first moment of freedom. My grandfather had, in the moments before that, helped to make a huge big Union Jack out of bits of rag. And he seemed to think that in his memo that Allied planes had thought it was a Japanese trick, and that's why they strafed them. I mean, it's this sort of staggering, yeah, that could happen. But they then made it to a nearby village, which is called War, W-A-W. And I managed to find that village where he was liberated, and I was told I was the first Westerner to go there, as far as they're aware. And it's a village. It's sort of built into a swamp almost. It's on bamboo houses on stilts, and it can't look any different to it did then. 100 years ago, 200 years ago, it's a village on sticks. There's no electricity. There's no running water. But I found a man in his 80s, and again, he remembered the Japanese running away. He remembered men from the village going to help chase them away, and the British coming through there. He remembered them being very tall. And it was incredible, really, one of the most special moments of my life, to find this village in just the middle of nowhere where, 70 odd years ago, my grandfather had become a free man.
What he experienced before that was, as you say, just beyond imagination, really. He talks particularly about listening to the recording of Dennis Gudgeon that left you with your head in your hands, describing how Private Berkovitch, the tailor, had been responsible for having to sew the dead bodies of comrades into sacks, and many other moments of just utter atrocity. You talk about the burning anger that it left you with. Did writing the book help you perhaps come to terms a bit with what you understood your father to have gone through? Did it help you to understand him as a man and the way that he was?
So it didn't calm me down. I think I got more and more angry writing it, especially when I was reading about the experiments, and it's too easily and commonly just written off as this, Bushido and this hatred of surrender. I think that's an excuse. It's interesting that the Japanese soldiers on the front line, and if they were anything, they were extremely brave. There's no doubt about that. And they did have a warrior code. There is absolutely no doubt about that. We only need to look at the tiny numbers that surrendered. They would often go into full-fronted suicidal charges. The officers just waving swords around, and there's no doubt there was bravery. But it tended to be, as is often the case in any army, not the frontline troops, but the second-line troops that committed the worst atrocities. And the ones that were left in charge of prisons would often be the ones that were entirely unsuitable for anything else. And I think they were simply just cruel. Not providing medication is just cruel. I don't care how it's dressed up. And the carrying out medical experiments on prisoners, again, there should be something in any human, whatever you're taught, that just tells you that's wrong. But there wasn't. So no, it didn't. It didn't quell my anger or my genuine hatred for those that did that. My grandfather, it explains his distance. It explains his sadness. I don't know how he could have ever gone to sleep without thinking of the people that he would stitch into those Hessian coffins. It must have haunted him every day. And yes, it explains a lot, I suppose, yeah.
Of course. What's next for Dan Berke, the historian?
I'm not sure as much about history. I have to say, I'm quite into my son loves dogs. He's crazy about them. And I did think that this story about the dogs being used, trained to run between these column commanders and
they were carrying messages to the subunits.
Yeah. Well, because the radios were huge things, you know, that we carried on mules, and if they got knocked out of action, then it was quite difficult. So with each column, there was a reconnaissance team. I mean, they were all reconnaissance, but there were teams within teams, and there would be one person from that and a person who would be with the commander, and they were trained to run a dog between each other. I do think that'd make a great story. So maybe one day I'd like to write about that. And it was often a lot of the survivors, if they were asked about heroics, they'd all say it was the mules that were heroes. And actually, the mules suffered very badly. They had to be slaughtered for food in the end, or slaughtered because they may have given away the Chindits when they were desperately trying to escape. So Wingate had ordered that they be killed. The animal transport officer was the youngest of the Chindits. He was only 18 or 19, I think, when he went in. Most of them were quite a bit older, late 20s, early 30s. And he had this, having looked after these mules the whole way, he had the heartbreaking job of slaughtering them. And I think it's quite easy to forget the animals of war, but with the Chindits, they were very much part of it. But it's people call the war in Burma the forgotten war. But I mean, what the 14th Army achieved was really something else under Slim. And the sacrifices were incredible. I'd like to learn a lot more about Operation Thursday. The second Chindit expedition, the first one, 3,000. The second one, closer to 20,000 when you add in all the sort of tag-on units. And they landed on gliders in jungle clearings. So many were killed when the gliders crashed. Fortified fire bases. Some say they were less effective because the advantage the first Chindit expedition had was that they were fast and they could move and they could melt into the jungle and disappear. Whereby the Japanese learned where these fortified bases were and they could attack them. And it was brutal. I mean, at one base called Blackpool, they were fighting 15, 20 meters away from each other. And when it became clear they were going to be overrun and they had to abandon the base, they killed their own wounded. The ones that they just weren't ready to leave them to the Japanese. They killed as many as they could with morphine.
Yes.
And the ones that were unconscious, they killed with pistols, because the alternative would have been bayonets or being burnt alive. And it wasn't something they could. And for commanders in their 20s to make those decisions.
We forget how young some of these were, and as you say, they had positions of command, sometimes quite senior, so young, far younger than you would see in modern armies or in peacetime as well. And as you say, it's always in danger. The victory over Japan is always in danger of being the forgotten war. The focus always on what happened in Europe and VE Day. But with the 80th anniversary next year of the end of the war, we will be doing something with AJEX to particularly mark VJ Day and the Jewish contribution to that. Actually, our last Burma veteran, Arthur Lawson, passed earlier this year, a hero of the Battle of Impal. As you know, Frank was an active AJEX member and standard bearer.
My dad tells me he used to be the standard bearer.
Yeah, fantastic. So we wanted to do something for you and your family to mark that, and also say thank you for uncovering, promoting this corner of Jewish military history. So first we have the AJEX plaque to present you and to say thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
But we also wanted to give you something that reflects your memories of Frank and everything that he stood for as well. Now, I don't know if this is exactly like the one that he had. I'll try and put it in the middle here. It is rather heavy, but I hope that it might have been close enough. I know that you do talk about this in the book as well. But
goodness,
there you go. So hopefully it is quite similar. It's a 1950s Singer sewing machine.
It's exactly similar.
Oh, well, that's amazing. And the plaque says that it's awarded by AJEX to Daniel Berke, services to Jewish military history, and in memory of Frank Berkovitch, tailor, soldier, and hero. A thank you to him, and a thank you to
so much. That's probably the most incredible gift I think I've ever had. Really.
Excellent one. I'm glad. So a little bit bigger than we would usually present to people, but it just felt so appropriate because of what you talk about, and again, the role that tailoring played in his life and his service as well.
Thank you. I'm rarely lost for words.
Yeah.
I am.
Yeah. Dan, thanks very much for joining us. For those who wish to read more, and I hope that is everyone, Capture Behind Japanese Lines is published by Pen and Sword Books and is available from all the usual places. This has been For Honour's Sake.
Thank you.